Today, we're going to be going into Module 1.4b. As you can see, as indicated by the B, this is the second lecture for Module 1.4. So if you haven't watched the lecture for Module 1.4a yet, go ahead and do that first before coming to the second lecture, which is this one. So in this lecture, we're going to be covering basic speech structure. Now, the information I'm going to give you is not an end-all, be-all for the way you should always write your speeches. It is just a very basic and fundamental approach, or I guess you could say template, to writing and organizing your speeches. Now, the reason I'm going to be giving you this information is so that you can kind of get a quick, very foundational level of understanding on what you should be expecting to do when you're writing your speeches. Now, as you can see here, I've written three main things. Just like any essay, speeches have three parts, right? They have an introduction, which is the first part. They have a body, or the middle/meat of the speech, as I like to call it. And they have a conclusion. So as you can see, just like an essay, right? So, in this module, we're going to be going into each of those three parts separately, and I'm going to be explaining to you what you should be doing in each of those three parts in order to draft an effective and convincing and impactful speech. Okay, so the first part of any speech, of course, is the introduction or the opening. Now, I've put on the board 3 bullet points here, 3 main things essentially that you want to do in your introduction or the opening of your speech. Now, this first bullet point, hook, meaning attracting your audience's attention. That's really important because you don't want to just delve into your speech without having your audience fully engaged with you. Now, how are you going to grab your audience's attention? That's what these 2 bullet points down here are for, right? Look at the third bullet point. The first thing you want to do is prove to your audience why it's worth their time, effort, and energy for them to have to listen to what you have to say. In essence, you need to do these 2 main things. Prove the importance and prove the relevance of the topic of your speech. In other words, you need to prove to them how is what you're speaking on going to affect your audience, and how is what you're speaking on, how does that relate to the current day and age, right? The next thing you need to do is establish the context and provide some background information on the topic of your speech. Most likely, your audience probably does not have as good or as informed of an understanding of the topic of your speech as you do. So it's your job to make sure that they get as informed as you are on this topic in your speech. The way you're going to do that, once again, is by providing some quick background information and context about kind of what the basic content of your speech is on. Only after doing that can you really go in to what the main body/meat of your speech is focused on. All right, so let's move on to the second part, which is the middle or the meat of your speech, right? Now, this is the portion of your speech where you're going to talk about your individual reasons or points, as I like to call them. And this is especially useful. This strategy is especially useful for when you're giving persuasive speeches. But it's called the CER strategy. What that stands for, what each letter stands for, I've written right here, right? Claim, evidence, reasoning. So the first part, which is the claim. Well, the claim is very simple. You're going to be stating some kind of affirmative comment, right? For example, if you're talking about, if you're trying to say electric cars are better than gas cars, right? If that's your argument, then maybe a claim for that is electric cars pollute the environment less than gas cars, right? You're making an affirmative statement there because you're saying that electric cars are better than gas cars because they help the environment, right? The next thing you're going to do is have some evidence. Now, I've put evidence, I've put a little arrow here and put they say in quotes. That's because the evidence doesn't come from you, of course. This is your ethos, right? If you go back to module 1.4a, you'll see that I talked about rhetoric. So this is your ethos. You're establishing credibility. Now, the way you're establishing credibility is by referencing outside sources. So let's say you're talking about how electric cars are better than gas cars, and you're talking about the specific claim that electric cars pollute the environment less. Maybe you're going to pull some evidence from the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an agency in the United States government, which says that, oh, you know, electric cars do not have any emissions while gas cars do have emissions, right? That would be an example of evidence because it's coming from another source. But the evidence isn't enough in the middle or the meat of your speech. You need to go one step further. That's where your reasoning comes into play, right? This is the I say, meaning you have your claim, you have your evidence, but you need to inject your own voice into the conversation, right? Sure, other sources have said X, Y, Z about why electric cars are better than gas cars. But you need to use that evidence to back up your own arguments, right? You need to reason your way through this idea that electric cars are better than gas cars using your own voice and your own ideas. So this would be more of your logos, right? Because this is your own logic and your own reasoning. Okay, so a couple more things for the middle or the meat of your speech, right? This is the portion of the speech in which the specific information that showcases the importance and relevance of the topic you're speaking on is covered. So remember, I told you that in the introduction, you're answering the question about why it's worth for the audience to spend their time, energy, and effort to listen to what you're saying. In the introduction, you're just briefly addressing that question. But it is in the middle, in the meat of your speech, that your content really drives them to answer that question themselves. Right? That's why I have the second bullet point here. The content of your speech, meaning the various arguments you have in favor or against whatever topic you're speaking on, right? 99% of that happens in the meat of your speech. So make sure you're allocating probably around 90 to 95% of your time to this part of your speech. This part of your speech is also the majority of your speech, right? The introduction and conclusion might be only 1 to 2 paragraphs, but the middle and meat of your speech will probably be anywhere between 5 to 15 paragraphs, relatively, depending on the length of the type of speech you're giving. So make sure you're spending a lot of time reviewing this part of your speech, because this is where you're going to be able to make an impact on your audience the most. Okay, so the final part of your speech, which is your conclusion, is pretty simple actually. As long as you've done a good job on your introduction and your body or the middle or the meat of your speech, your conclusion should come together pretty simply on its own. So a couple things you really want to make sure you do for your conclusion, right? You want to transition into your ending. Don't just abruptly say, and yes, we're done, right? Transition into your ending. Say, finally, or say, to conclude, right? Or say, to end. You want to make sure that you're making that smooth movement from the middle of your speech to the end of your speech. The next thing you want to do is restate, only very briefly though, your reasons, right? You don't want to go all over the middle of your speech again. You just want to very briefly say your claims that you laid out in the meat of your speech just so that it stays fresh in your audience's mind. The third thing is that you always want to leave your audience with something to think about. This is probably the most important reason to have a strong conclusion. I call this the speech legacy, right? So you want to ask yourself, what kind of impact am I trying to make on my audience by delivering this speech, right? What kind of impact do I want to carry through with the message of my speech? So if you can answer that question, then you'll be able to figure out what you want to say to your audience in your conclusion, so that even after you're completed with your speech, right? Even after they're walking out of that auditorium or that like outdoor area, wherever it is, right? Even after they're walking out of the area where you gave your speech, they're thinking about the things that you said. It's really important to leave that lasting impact on your audience. The last thing about a conclusion is you want to end in a timely fashion. Too often do I see people going on and on and on with their conclusion because they're trying to drill into their audience's mind some point that they didn't make clear in their body or the middle of their speech. The conclusion is not meant for that. You should have established those reasons in the middle of your speech already. So it's really important that in your conclusion, you're not spending that much time. You just want to run through your reasons very quickly, make sure you're leaving that lasting impact on your audience, and end your speech there. That's it. All right, so hopefully you got those notes down. That concludes Module 1.4b. Thanks for tuning in, and review those notes to get ready for the quiz.